Do you know what a woman is now?
I absolutely do. You know, as the Supreme Court has said, in law, a trans woman is a woman, except in respect of the Equality Act. And the Equality Act is clear, and I totally respect the Supreme Court's ruling. Indeed, I accepted it on the very morning it came out.
So what is a woman? I mean, are you saying that in certain circumstances it can be a trans woman?
Well, I'm saying what the Supreme Court said. I mean, I believe in the rule of law.
If globalism had a face, it would be the trite, shameless and idiotic mug of Ed Davey, leader of the Lib Dems, who are polling second in many polls, despite not knowing what a woman is. In that clip, you saw him declare the supremacy of the rule of law over democracy, dismissing the wishes of the people as subordinate to bureaucratic edicts. Though the rule of law sounds innocuous, virtuous even, it masks a deeper ideological revolution. The rule of law is a belief system, a secular religion, that justifies all manner of insanity, from the denial of biological reality to the creation of a caste system that places foreign criminals as morally superior to decent native citizens. It allows the bureaucrat to assert what a woman is and when, and expects us to comply not because it is true, but because the bureaucracy has spoken. The rule of law is not a generic term that refers to a time immemorial legal concept. It is not about the impartial application of equal laws passed by a representative body. In other words, the rule of law has nothing to do with what everybody thinks it does, which is English common law. Rather, it is a specific dogma that asserts the supranational bureaucratic order that governs the world without consent, debate, or the accountability that nationalism facilitates. This system of regulation is not a natural evolution of legal tradition, at least not in England, and good governance, but it is a weaponized ideology, a cloak for global power, detached from the real world, and thus the destruction of the English and every other nation state. To understand the meaning of the rule of law in today's discourse, we must realise that it is an Orwellian instrument. It echoes the egalitarian notion of English common law, with laws applied equally and debated, as I say, by the elected parliament, but it has been engineered into the exact opposite. I would argue that it is not even law at all. It's a regulatory bureaucracy whose diktats are neither transparent nor open to challenge. It is the Kafkaesque maze of edicts that dictate what can and cannot be done merely by ideological fiat. The lawmakers of the rule of law are a new priestly class, making and interpreting doctrine, issuing judgments without public input, practical outcome or empirical evidence at all, merely to maintain ideological orthodoxy, all for a religion which none of us actually wanted or converted to, and in many ways actually don't even realise exists. The central deceit in this lay in the elevation of the rule of law above democracy, or more broadly, the representative parliament. By coupling the rule of law to democratic rhetoric, insisting that only bad men like Putin or Xi would be against it, its proponents have claimed a legitimacy for it, whilst negating the very democratic mechanism that grants it. When they say that the United Kingdom is both a democracy and a state of the rule of law, they obscure the fact that the two are not equal, and that the rule of law always trumps democracy. And since the rule of law is rooted in abstract supranational bodies, and democracy is rooted in the nation, this means the nation will always lose. It will always be subordinate and controlled by the supranational. In other words, you can vote all you want against what they want. Nothing will change. This is not like having a final authoritative body within a single country and of a country. It's outside it, and it's usually against it. The English legal system rooted itself in the principle of representation and law as an instrument of government for justice and peace. Laws were passed by the elected parliament and arbitrated by judges accountable to that same government and thus the nation. The law passed in Parliament were called statute law, and they were always intended to be limited and specific in nature, for example to enact a manifesto to deal with contemporaneous issues. Most law in England and most justice was supposed to be dealt with by common law, which was grounded in precedent, aka experience, as well as local knowledge, the heritage of the people, and the empirical reasoning of the judges and the juries that oversaw its administration. This is because law was not something done to the people, but of the people. That law did not at all rule, but in fact served. Law was the servant of the polity and of politics, where politics in England was the expression of the national character, its history and will, of us. In contrast, the rule of law is not a product of any of these things, and certainly not a national political discourse, but a supranational construct, developed and enforced by unaccountable bodies. Its real purpose is to shield the global elite from democratic, aka national accountability, and turn our former nation-state homes into mere provinces and a global empire, a new Rome. Bodies like the UN or the EU, or their local representatives like the Supreme Court, or indeed the UN inspectors who come to visit us, as if from Rome to tell us what to do, have weaponized things like the human rights law or minority rights as tools to subvert sovereignty and fulfill their own desires and powers. For example, they want the freedom of movement and people. They always have. It's how they make more money. Ergo, you need to tear down the sovereign nation state because it has borders. They get in the way of these people's money. Consider how, in the name of minority rights, bureaucracies now ensure the right of invaders and colonizers to enforce themselves upon indigenous Europeans. English common law always protected the individual who was a part of society, that being the right granted for taking on the personal responsibility of being Englishmen. Now, anybody who arrives the day before yesterday, or indeed tomorrow, whether from Syria or China, can expect all of the protections of an Englishman, and many more, without taking on any of the responsibility. This new system protects groups, and always the, as they would say, non-white, or as we as nationalists would say, non-English group, against the majority of the nation. This is not justice. This is legalized colonization. And as I said, this is done for profit and power. So if Apple can gain 0.001% more revenue from open borders, then open borders it is. If hedge funds gain a boost from the Muslim invasion, and that means Islam ascending to political power, well then martial law, prostrate yourself, infidel. In every case, the outcome is justified not because it is right or desired, but because it conforms to the ideology, and the ideology is a cover for the power and money. What we are witnessing, therefore, is not just the destruction of the English or the nation-state polity, but the reimposition of the Roman Empire. In Rome, law and politics are one. The emperor's will was law, as surely as any pagan god's will was natural law, hence the obsession with natural law amongst the Romans and today's bourgeois. That same model is the globalist bureaucracy. Just as the Roman Empire was a series of provinces ruled by a hierarchy of magistrates and governors who used this system to enact their personal power, and also then as military men, today we have the globalists who, as politicians, are the governors of our provinces and then become business people as well. The rule of law is the will of the elite, then as in now. It's not a coincidence that the institutions promoting this model are supranational. Now, if you think that nations are the source of all evil, aka Nazism, as we have been told, you might think this is a good thing. Indeed, that is actually the most common reason why people say we need this system, because in the past, the nation-state caused all of our problems. I think it's time that we tear down this shibboleth. Nazism is called right-wing nationalism. But the right is a term that contains liberalism, conservatism, fascism, National Socialism, American Christianity, on and on. It's a useless term. It encompasses diametrically opposed, entirely unrelated political concepts, and it basically means not socialist, as if socialism is the default. Furthermore, nationalism is the English political tradition, where society is conceived as a nation, a group of people rooted in and made of history, deriving their values from that historical experience and real makeup, and we might call that heritage. And we argue by empiricism, that is to say, evidence, the demonstration that something actually works. We live by genealogy of history and by facts, as opposed to, say, the liberal or socialists, whose values are derived from their own ego, and they argue by rationalism, in other words, rationalization, just making up arguments to justify what you want. Again, the Nazis, as I said, were national socialists. That is their party and movement name, and we should start using it again so they can't hide. Just as the French got everything wrong about the English polity when they analysed it, So too did the Germans, translating our notion, the English notion, of nation into their own concept, which is race. The Nazis are racial socialists. They opposed their forebears, the class socialists, like the Marxists, and they opposed the liberal German establishment. Hence why Hitler never restored the Kaiser, the monarchy, the heart of the old German state. It's because he was a socialist who hated actual German history and wanted a revolution. The Nazis were also not nationalists, but racial imperialists. Race was the basis of their society, not nationality. In other words, they based themselves on an invented biological genealogy, not a real historical genealogy. Which is why National Socialists had no problem annexing Austria. To them, there are no nations, no independent nations, no sovereignty. There's just one German race. So there was nothing wrong in annexing Austria. Nazis believed in mythology, not history, ideology, not heritage. And let's be honest, even if they were nationalist, so too was everybody else. So nationalism cannot be the defining factor when the countries that opposed Nazism were nationalist. The problem here is, of course, the postmodernist attack following the war, which was, for example, from the Frankfurt School, focused entirely upon saying we're all Nazis. Anyway, a racist, socialist, imperialist perfectly describes the ideology of globalist empire as we live it today. These are the direct descendants of it via postmodernism, which united the racial and class left in Germany, the precluding union. Hence, the rule of law facilitates invasion, aka mass immigration, and cultural subversion. This is conquest under the guise of legal necessity, nothing more. British citizens who object are not countered with argument or evidence, you're just silenced with legal threats. The bureaucracy is immune to reason because it is not concerned with truth or justice, just obedience. That's why you're called a racist for doing it. Racist means heretic. The effects of this shift are not hypothetical. In towns across the United Kingdom, such as Rotherham and Bradford, vast criminal conspiracies have been ignored or downplayed because confronting them would violate the ideological dictates of the new regime and show that actually having your country invaded by millions of people from places around the world whose culture is not simply different, but so incompatible it is actually illegal here. To acknowledge these crimes would be to admit that the rule of law is absurd at best and hostile to truth and justice in practice. Since they can't admit this, they turn against their own people. British girls were sacrificed on the altar of the rule of law, not because it protected them, but because it protected the narrative. It is not very long ago the entire world, the entire English people, would have found it impossible to believe that a British Prime Minister would be locking up Englishmen from defending their country against invasion instead of, if not locking up, opposing that invasion. This demonstrates that new religious character to this doctrine. This is neo-paganism. It's a materialist theocracy. Like Muslim imams, modern legal bureaucrats interpret regulatory divine texts, usually utterly obscure to the public, and they produce preordained outcomes. It is why globalism loves Islam. They have the same character, a slave character. The law is no longer debated or derived from shared experience. It's just handed down from an unreachable caste of fake experts. This is not the rule of law in any democratic sense. It's the rule of clerks, and every time they interpret the law, it just so happens to align with what they want. As the saying goes, German policy is not always EU policy, but EU policy is always German policy. Hence, we are those Kafka protagonists. We live in an impenetrable bureaucracy, seeking solutions from people who will never help us, who hate us, and we will be punished for crimes that cannot even be named. It is a system that is simultaneously omnipresent, yet intangible. That is the sign that it is a totalitarian society, a fantasy imposed on reality. And law does not reflect life, it replaces it here. Ed Davey expresses the core faith of the elite, that laws are not tools of self-governance, but instruments of ideology. So when the Supreme Court dictates when and where a man becomes a woman, hocus pocus like magic voodoo, this cult that rules, Ed Davey simply accepts it, because it's an article of dogma, and what matters to the dogmatic is group obedience, to be a slave. This is why the Englishmen have always called themselves freemen. It's because our polity was opposed to this. And the rule of law is the inversion of politics, a society where elected politicians defer to the unelected bureaucrats, the new priests. The problem here is not that we are not an absolute democracy. The English polity was never an absolute democracy, but as alluded to earlier, every institution that made up our polity, our unwritten constitution, was part of a singular nation and singular national government. When liberals and socialists dismantled these various institutions, in the name of democracy ironically, they were lying. They were just creating a vacuum into which could flow a bureaucracy of themselves. That's why it's a revolution. For example, most people would say that the monarchy and the landed aristocracy, being hereditary, are anti-democratic. Well, in one sense, but in another sense, they're not. In fact, in the real sense, they're not. Because what the hereditary monarchy and aristocracy are in our constitution are the institutions of the historical nation, the historical demos. This is what makes us a transcendent nation rooted in history. Their role in the Constitution is to be guardians of the historical nation and therefore of the Constitution itself, to make sure there is not a tyranny of the Commons. They're meant to be sage advisors for the Commons, stopping them from doing anti-constitutional things. Of course now, and the Commons itself, another way to think of it is that it is the contemporaneous demos, us, right? So the aristocracy was a historical demos, the Commons is a contemporaneous demos. Now, the point of having a hereditary monarchy and a hereditary aristocracy is that they're protected from subversion and corruption and usurpation. The reason Republicans hate the monarchy is because they hate the fact that there is someone that can be head of state. There is a position that they can't have, and they hate that. This is exactly why they've got rid of our lords, our hereditary people, and they've repurposed the monarchy. And what have they replaced it with? Political appointees, stooges, people that just do what they want, people that don't speak for the nation, but that just rubber stamp the globalist directives that are coming to us. There is no representation from this. The monarchy, the aristocracy, the church, the commons, they all work together to form a polity grounded in legitimacy, history and representation. These institutions were not checks on power. They were components of a harmonious whole, a self-governing nation. Contrast that with the rule of law and the creation of a caste system in the United Kingdom. The UK governments, after World War II, passed early race relations acts not out of justice, but to establish the framework for minority rule. This is exactly what Enoch Powell warned about. These laws were the first step towards legalised inequality. In other words, racism, a Nazi state, with Englishmen at the bottom. The bureaucracy enables fast-tracked minorities to ascend into power without historical integration or merit. How is it possible that immigrants who have arrived in just the last decade or two suddenly dominate all of our political parties, all of our institutions? This is because they are the vanguard of a new ideologically justified, a new aristocracy, not rooted in the nation, not of us, but of the global elite, to rub the right's nose in diversity, as the Blairites used to say, and probably still do say. This is not accidental. The racial caste system is exactly what was imposed by the Normans after their conquest of 1066, only now it's not justified by a divine right or a crusading right, but by human rights. And it is not designed to integrate the minorities, it's to perpetuate a system of rule that bypasses the native majority, creating a tyranny. What is a rule of a minority called, my friends? I believe that is called a tyranny. And that is why our new Roman Empire is administered by clerks and lawyers and NGOs. It's a meta-fascism. Corporations and bureaucrats rule under the smokescreen of human rights, climate change and anti-racism. All of these ideological ideas fused together are just the justification for conquest. And if you question it, you're the Nazi. You are the bad man, even though the system itself is the true inheritor of this, a racist socialist imperialism derived directly from the post-war postmodern philosophy. Don't think that you will ever get them to admit this. Just like Adolf Eichmann's infamous defense at his trial, where he said he was only following orders, it mirrors exactly the mentality of them today. They follow the rule of law without question, regardless of consequences. If it says that a Pakistani or a Syrian must receive houses and benefits while English people get nothing, sleep on the streets, are struggling to get by, then that's what must happen. And if you question it, you're a criminal. Finally then, what must be done? We must name the system for what it is. Not the rule of law, but the will of rulers. We must reject the fate complexity that Ed Davey talks about when he tries to discuss how exactly a woman can become a man and a man a woman when they step over this barrier or over that threshold. Fake complexity is created to justify fake experts. Life is not a maze of bureaucracy. It's actually quite simple. The devil, of course, is in the details. We might want to begin by pointing out that nations have a right to exist, people have a right to self-government, and law serves the nation, not the other way around. We must restore the English legal tradition. Law must once again be rooted in the nation's will, debated by representatives, and interpreted by accountable judges. Parliament must be supreme and sovereign and singular again. Bureaucracy must be purged of ideological parasites and returned to essential administrative function. The supranational order must be dismantled and the nation-state reaffirmed as the highest political authority. This certainly won't be easy. But from now on, when you hear the phrase the rule of law, know that you are not hearing somebody mention a common, time immemorial generic phrase. You are hearing a globalist tell you that they deserve to rule you because they say so, and you have to do as you're told. When you hear the phrase the rule of law, just ask, whose law? And if it is not ours, then the system is not one of law, it's one of tyranny. Thank you. If you enjoyed this lecture, please consider sharing it and donating to the PayPal link found in the description or in the information page of the channel. I'm an independent historian and philosopher, and I rely on your support to be heard and carry out my research. Thank you to those that have generously contributed so far. Keep learning.